Good morning. My name is Tina Nybo-Jensen. I'm Senior Coordinator Governance Relation at GRI. Welcome to this meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, known by its acronym, the GSSB, held on the 22nd of March. This virtual meeting is being held in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Please note that all public GSSB meetings are being recorded, and you can find the audio recording on the GSSB webpage, along with high-level summaries of previous GSSB meetings. Present from the GRI Secretariat today are Bastian Bock, the Director Standards Division, Chelsea Reinhardt, Deputy Director Standards Division, Lara Espinach, Manager Standards Division, and Pamela Carpio, Senior Coordinator Governance Relations. And we'll now start with a roll call of the GSSB members. We have Mr. Attila Yalikaya.
Present.
Thank you. And Mr. Daniel Ingram. Present. Mr. Dwight Justice.
Present.
Mr. Evan Harvey.
Present.
Thank you. And Ms. Julia Wilson.
Present.
And Mr. Jürgen Buchsbaum.
I'm present.
Good. And Mr. Ken Swift.
Present.
And Ms. Kirsten Margrethe Hovey.
Present.
And Mr. Michel Washer.
Present.
And Mr. Nankumar Vadakapat.
Present.
And Ms.
Thank you.
Robin Leeson.
Present.
And Mr. Stian van Draag.
Present.
And Ms. Sulema Pioli.
Present.
And Ms. Judy Kuszewski, the DSSB Chair.
Present. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And then we would just like to note that DSSB member, Mr. Daniel Zayang, sent his apologies to this meeting. Also joining us today are the members of the GRI Due Process Oversight Committee, Mr. Godwell Namo, Mr. Sanjeev Besbaroa, Mr. Stan Rogers, Mr. Volker Huns, and Chair of the Due Process Oversight Committee, Ms. Riva Krut, who are attending this meeting as observers. And I'll now hand to the Chair, Judy Kuszewski, to open the meeting.
Thank you very much, Tina. Good morning to all members present today. It's a lovely morning in Amsterdam, and I hope we'll have a fascinating and productive day today together. I'd also like to start by acknowledging and welcoming the members of the Due Process Oversight Committee who are sitting behind me this morning. They will be meeting over the course of the next couple of days, fulfilling their own mandate as an organization, and we're perfectly happy to have them with us and hope that they learn a lot about our process. If there's anything that we can do to help you, please let us know. Before we start our review of our agenda today, I want to flag that in your packet of papers that was in front of your place yesterday, we have a few documents that you need to be aware of. We have, in particular, there is a sheet that has the has some statements that you need to sign and return to GRI. This is the internal GSSB commitment statements, which refers to the conflict of interest policy, the public communications protocol, the confidentiality protocol, and the conduct guidelines during meetings. And there is also on the reverse of this sheet the GSSB commitment to the public interest statement. We also have in that packet the actual policies and protocols referred to in these statements in case you are unfamiliar with them and want to refer back to them. The point is that they do need to be returned. They can be returned electronically, but they're sitting in front of you, so if you get a moment to sign them, please do so before the end of today. Thank you very much. Today's agenda is on the screen in front of us, and it should also be in your papers. We have a few important items to get through, particularly before lunch, which is where we start to lose a few members right around lunchtime, and then during the course of the afternoon, a few members will need to leave a little bit early. So our important conversations have been front-loaded to the morning. After we're finished with this welcoming session, we will be looking at the review of the human rights related standards, which has been under discussion and a subject of a certain amount of research and debate within the Secretariat and externally, and we know is on our work plan. We then will be looking at the implications for GRI standards pertaining to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That is something that was brought up at our last meeting, which we knew we wanted to revisit. We will then be looking at a discussion of how do we prioritize standard-setting projects within our work plan. We know we have lots of potential things that could be changed in the standards, or new content that could be developed. We need to talk a little bit more about how we make decisions as to which ones rise to the top. After lunch, we will have an update on the 2 working groups that have just recently been commissioned by this board on water and occupational health and safety. We will then go back and review the GSSB work plan with respect to, this is revisiting the session that we started the day with yesterday. The purpose being to reflect on some of the resource implications of the decisions that we will have at that point taken over the course of these 2 days, so that we can understand what then needs to be done on a practical level. We have any other business section in the agenda later on in the afternoon. At the moment, we have just a couple of items in that AOB. One of them is the discussion of assurance that we had started yesterday. We'll pick that up a little bit. If any other members have other issues that you would like to add to that, please let me know maybe in the break, and we'll just keep a running tab of that. We've got half an hour for AOB. And we will close the public meeting at 4:10 in the afternoon here in Amsterdam. And then we would just have a simple reflection session and close of the private meeting following that. Are there any questions about the agenda today? Okay, good. In that case, I'd like to welcome Laura from the Standards Division to talk with us about the human rights related standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. The aim of this session now is to have an initial discussion with you on the review of the human rights related standards, and to get your initial ideas and input before we go ahead with this project. And although this is just for discussion today, it would be important to seek agreement on how to move this project forward beyond this meeting. Just as a way of background, as you all know, last December the GSSB issued its work program in which it identified human rights as a priority area for reviewing the standards. And in that work program, it was already noted that this review could potentially encompass multiple standards, and that it could result in merging or restructuring the standards. And given the scale and complexity of this project and how many standards could be impacted, the Standards Division started by conducting an initial scoping exercise to understand what could be improved in the standards for human rights and how we could organize this review more effectively. And the outcome of this scoping exercise is presented in item 9 for us to discuss today. As part of the scoping exercise, we did 3 things. We interviewed interested GSSB members, and that included Sulema Pioli, Dwight Justice, and Daniel Taliant. And thank you very much for the time that you dedicated to that. And we also interviewed external human rights experts. And in Annex 1 of the paper, you can find the full list of experts that we consulted during this initial scoping work. We also researched latest developments in the field to understand what has happened in the last few years and what are the key frameworks or standards that could be helpful in referring to as part of this process. And we also did a limited review of literature in this area. And finally, because the guiding principles came up as the key framework to align with during the initial conversations with the experts, we also did an initial gap analysis between the standards and the guiding principles to see what are the existing gaps with regards to this framework. And that you can find in Annex 3 of the paper, and I will share the initial findings of this analysis with you. There are two key points that we would like to discuss with you today. The first one is on what is it that we are trying to achieve with this project. So I will explain the outcome of the work that we have done and what are the key objectives or areas for improvement that we have identified. And at that point, we will break to confirm with the GSSB whether we want to indeed go ahead with this project and whether these are the areas that we want to focus on for this topic. And then we will present our proposed process for updating the human rights standards. We're proposing to do this in 2 phases, and I will explain what each phase entails. And at that point, we will break to get comments from the GSSB on this proposed process. So first, I want to give you an overview of the human rights contents that you can currently find in the GRI standards and how these came about. So currently we have 7 standards that deal directly with human rights. So these include, for example, GRI 406 on non-discrimination or GRI 407 on freedom of association and collective bargaining. And in Annex 2, you can find the full overview of the 7 standards and also the disclosures that you can find within those. However, human rights are intertwined with many other topics in the standards, and human rights impacts can also be reported through other standards, such as those that look at occupational health and safety, customer privacy, or water, just to give you a few examples. The human rights contents that we have at the moment were last updated in 2011, and that was during the development of the G3.1 guidelines. And the aim of that review was to follow up on some of the expectations that have been emerging at that time with regards to business and human rights, and the key reference back then was the UN Framework for Business and Human Rights from 2008. And that review created content in 2 areas, one around human rights risk assessments, and the other one on grievance remediation. But the rest of the human rights content remained largely the same as it was before that update. So when you look at the history of developing and updating the GRI guidelines, the human rights contents were updated not too long ago, especially when you compare that to other topics, like the ones we discussed yesterday around economic issues. So one of the first questions that we had when we started this review is, why should we update this content now, and what has changed so dramatically since 2011 that makes us look at these contents again? So that's what we try to investigate with the experts and through our research. What we found is that since the last update of the human rights contents, the most important development has been the launch of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were launched also in 2011, the same year as the G3.1 guidelines. The UN Guiding Principles aim to operationalize the 2008 framework, and they were unanimously endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. And since the launch of the UN Guiding Principles, they have become the authoritative global reference for businesses to address human rights, and they have been widely implemented by a wide range of actors. So to give you a few examples of how they have been widely implemented, the principles have been adopted by numerous frameworks that look at responsible business conduct, And the most notable example are the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which included a brand new human rights chapter in line with the guiding principles. And the OECD is doing now a lot of work to follow up on that, and they are developing specific due diligence guidance also in line with the guiding principles. And also later in 2013, the GRI issued the G4 guidelines, which updated content on different areas like supply chain, topic boundary, and management approach. And the guiding principles were a key reference point for updating content in all of those areas. Also, governments have done a lot of work in the last few years to implement the guiding principles via national action plans. And at the time of writing this paper, 13 states had produced a national action plan, and 22 other states were in the process of developing one. The last few years have also seen new reporting frameworks emerge in this area, and the most notable one is the UN Guiding Principles Reporting Framework, which was published in 2015 by Shift and Mazars. And this is a reporting framework to report exclusively on the implementation of the guiding principles. Later in 2016, the Danish Institute for Human Rights updated its compliance assessment tool, and also the corporate human rights benchmark was launched, and the results of that were published just last week. But in addition to voluntary initiatives, there's also been a lot of legislation emerge in the last few years, mainly in the US and Europe, which looks at regulating human rights due diligence, either through transparency requirements or through obligations to conduct due diligence. Some examples, which many of you will know, include the French due diligence law, which was adopted just last month, the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, or the EU Directive on Non-Financial Reporting, which asks large companies in the EU to report on the key human rights risks, among other topics, and on the due diligence processes that they have implemented. So as you can see, a lot has happened in this field since the last update of the human rights contents in the standards, and the guiding principles have really become the authoritative reference in this space. And although the guiding principles already contain many of the concepts in the 2008 framework, which were already incorporated in the standards, we have not done yet a thorough and a holistic review of the human rights content from the perspective of the expectations in the guiding principles. So based on our conversations with the experts and the research that we have done, we have identified 3 key areas or objectives for reviewing the standards. The first one would be about ensuring further alignment with the UN guiding principles, and I will explain shortly what are the current gaps and where we can come closer with the guiding principles. The second would be about reviewing the scope of human rights that we cover in the standards. As you saw, we have 7 standards specifically focusing on human rights, but there could be more that we could add to the list. And finally, reviewing the topic-specific disclosures based on some of the challenges that the experts have flagged to us. So for the first one, as I mentioned, all experts indicated that the guiding principles was the key instrument that we should be looking at as part of this review. Other instruments were mentioned, such as the OECD guidelines, ISO 26000, or the ILO M&E declaration, but the experts also noted that those frameworks are also trying to align with the guiding principles. So the guiding principles are really the original source that we should look at as part of this process. So to understand where the existing gaps are, we did an initial gap analysis, which is in Annex 3. And based on our initial assessment, actually we already cover many of the principles in our standards. But there are 4 key gaps that we have seen, and many of these gaps are on a conceptual or structural level rather than at the level of individual disclosures. So the first gap, which is probably the most fundamental gap that we see, is that with the GRI standards, companies only report on human rights if they have been identified as material topics. So in theory, a company could produce a report in accordance with the GRI standards without reporting on human rights. Whereas the guiding principles introduce a universal expectation for all companies to respect human rights. And this responsibility applies to all companies everywhere, and it also applies to SMEs, not just to large multinational enterprises. And what the guiding principles say is that all companies must know and show how they meet this responsibility. And this might be at odds with our materiality approach in the standards. The next thing that the guiding principles say is that companies can prioritize human rights risks according to severity. And this actually compares quite nicely with our materiality approach. But above and beyond that, all companies, according to the guiding principles, have a responsibility to have policies and processes in place to know and show how they meet this responsibility. And at the moment, we don't have this covered in the GRI standards in a clear way. So one way of addressing this, as we were discussing yesterday for tax, could be to ask all companies through the general disclosures, for example, to explain how they meet this responsibility to respect human rights. And to give you an example, in the general disclosures, we are asking all companies to report on collective bargaining, which is a specific right, but we don't have a requirement for companies to explain what is their policy commitment to human rights in the first place, which if you look at the guiding principles, that would be the first logical step in the process. With regards to this point on materiality and how that fits with the guiding principles, experts also suggested that we could provide guidance on how our materiality approach fits with the prioritization approach in the guiding principles with regards to severity and salience of human rights risks. Another gap is that the guiding principles introduce expectations that are overarching, which means that they do not change from right to right. And that's why in the gap analysis, you will see that a lot of the links we've made are in the universal standards and not in the topic-specific standards. However, based on our existing model, we're asking companies to report on human rights mainly via the topic-specific standards. So that means that we probably should look at having an overarching set of requirements around the human rights policy commitment and due diligence process that sits above the materiality analysis, and that it is reported irregardless of what the material human rights topics are. The next gap, and this is a bit related to the one that I just mentioned, is about how the contents in the standards are currently structured. So even though we do have a lot of links with the guiding principles at the moment, all of those disclosures are found in multiple standards and multiple locations, so they are currently very difficult for users to find and to understand how to use the standards to report against the guiding principles in a consistent and holistic way. So there's probably a lot that we can do in terms of consolidating the human rights reporting requirements within the standards via, for example, a separate dedicated human rights standard. And when we were discussing this, experts suggested that GRI 1.2 on human rights assessment could actually be the umbrella standard for reporting on human rights. but that if we were to do that, we would probably need to review the location of that standard, because it is not really a topic that should be assessed based on materiality, but it's more about the overarching process for human rights. And finally, there are a few concepts in the guiding principles that are currently not sufficiently covered in the standards. And we've given two examples here. So one on remediation processes. So we do already include content around grievance mechanisms in the standards, but we're not explicitly asking companies to report on whether they have provided remedy for adverse human rights impacts. And the second concept would be the concept of leverage. We do mention this in the guidance for the topic boundary, but this is a concept that we have not yet explored in detail in the standards. And then just two more remarks about the gap analysis. And those are that a lot of the linkages that we have at the moment are within recommendations and guidance. So there's also a lot that we can do in terms of developing disclosures and requirements for some of the expectations in the guiding principles. And the second consideration would be that although we do cover a lot at the moment, those disclosures may not necessarily be the best disclosures to report against the guiding principles. So we should also look at the whole set of requirements from that perspective. And finally, we also saw a strong interest from the experts that we consulted to align with the UN Guiding Principles reporting framework by Shift. And what we hear from experts is that this framework has made a positive contribution to the reporting space, and that the disclosures or questions that they have developed are really considered to be best practice when it comes to human rights reporting. And if the GSSB was to align with this framework, then that would be an important consideration when putting together a group of experts. The second area is about reviewing the scope of human rights that we cover in the standards. So since one of the objectives is about aligning with the guiding principles, we went back to the guiding principles to see what they say about this issue. And what they say is that companies have a responsibility for all internationally recognized human rights, and that a company can have an impact on virtually any of these rights. So that defines the scope of human rights. However, the GRI standards cover only a small subset of rights via topic-specific standards. So in our conversations with the experts, we ask two things. So one is whether it actually makes sense to have topic-specific standards looking at different human rights, especially since we just saw that most of the expectations in the guiding principles are overarching and not really right-specific. And if so, what are the human rights that we should cover as a minimum in the GRI standards? So the first question was fairly straightforward. I think most experts agreed that it makes sense to have individual topic standards for key human rights and to provide detailed reporting guidance on child labor or non-discrimination, etc. However, the second question was much more difficult for the experts to answer. And we got different answers to this question. So to give you an example, one expert said that perhaps all 33 topic standards should be opened up and looked at from the perspective of human rights. And then other experts suggested additional rights that we could perhaps add to the list, especially those looking at vulnerable groups such as people with disabilities or migrant workers. However, at the same time, they also said that it is difficult to reduce human rights to just one list. And that is because human rights are interconnected, they are indivisible, and they also evolve over time. So it's difficult to come up with the one list of human rights. So in sum, we've seen very little consensus on which additional rights we should be adding to the set of standards. However, experts see value in retaining these topic standards, even if we don't cover all of the human rights. And what experts said is that as a minimum, the standards should be clear on this expectation in the guiding principles that businesses can have an impact on virtually any human right, and that should be an important consideration when looking at the materiality analysis. And third, so once we look at developing something that is overarching for human rights, and once we know what the list of human rights is that we should be looking at, the next logical step would be to review the topic-specific disclosures in the standards. In Annex 2, you have an overview of the topic-specific disclosures that we have for human rights. And as you can see, we have numerous quantitative measures for reporting on human rights, as well as a few disclosures that focus on actual impacts or incidents of violations of human rights. And through our initial conversations with the experts, it came clear very soon that the existing disclosures that we have probably have limitations, and they are probably not the best measures to report on human rights. And this is because these two areas of quantifying human rights performance and disclosing actual impacts are highly contested areas in the human rights space. So in terms of quantification, what we have heard from the experts is that every human right impact is one too many, and there is no need to count. And also that some of the quantitative measures that we have at the moment, they miss important contextual information, and that some of those measures on their own can actually be misleading, and they may not reflect the true performance of that company. And one example was provided with the disclosure on the number of violations of indigenous rights, where a low number of violations may not necessarily indicate good performance. It could actually indicate the opposite if, for example, the indigenous leaders have been previously arrested, and that indicates why there is a low number of violations in place. With regards to disclosing actual impacts, experts flagged both technical and legal challenges with this. So technical challenges relate mainly to definitions and what constitutes a human rights abuse in certain situations, as well as counting human rights abuses is also technically challenging, especially in the supply chain. And legal challenges, since a lot of the human rights abuses are actually illegal in many jurisdictions, and how can we reasonably expect companies to voluntarily disclose illegal activity? So these are some of the challenges that were flagged. So what we hear is that we probably need to revise the topic-specific disclosures. However, better disclosures may not yet exist and would need to be developed as part of this process. And I just want to close off by saying that the UN Working Group, which is following up on the implementation of the guiding principles, has recently called for better initiatives to measure the extent to which human rights abuses are being reduced in practice. And that is because a lot of the initiatives that exist at the moment focus mainly on measuring policies and processes, but not outcomes. And because of that, we know very little at the moment about whether we're actually reducing human rights abuses in practice. So that would be something for the GSSB to consider, whether through our standards or through other activities of the GSSB or the GRI, we want to provide a reporting solution to this challenge identified by the working group. So now I'll turn it over to you, Judy, to guide us through the discussion. At this stage, we just want to reconfirm with the GSSB whether we want to go ahead with revisiting these contents at this stage, and whether these 3 objectives or areas are indeed the focus of the work that the GSSB want to conduct.
Sure. Thank you, Laura. Before we start that, I will ask Chelsea to just make a little comment.
Sure. One quick thing to bear in mind, Lara gave a great overview and explanation. When we talk about universal sort of human rights expectations and the way that that relates to our materiality approach, one thing to bear in mind is that later today we will also have a discussion about the TCFD draft recommendations on climate change. And one of the points we will discuss there as well is, are there emerging norms that have really come out in the last 5 to 10 years about businesses' responsibilities to consider their impacts on climate change or on human rights that might call for a different approach in the standards? Now, I don't know if there's a right answer to that. That's for you guys to debate. But just bear in mind when we go through this discussion on human rights that there will be parallels with the one we will visit in the afternoon as well on climate change.
Thanks, Chelsea. So let's pause here for a minute just to discuss this first portion of what Laura has put in front of us. And so right now, the idea here is to talk about what are the objectives overall at quite a high level for the review of the human rights related standards. We'll get into the discussion of process and working groups and involvement of various people and that sort of thing. But for now, the questions are just about what it is that we want to aim to achieve with this review for now. So the 2 questions that Laura has put in front of us are, does the GSSB agree with the objectives and areas for improvement identified? And are there any other developments that should be considered as part of this review process? I see Stian and Dwight have both indicated they'd like to speak. So Stian, would you like to begin?
Thanks, Judy. 3 observations. I fully support the objectives and the need to review the human rights standards. The first question that I have is based on the discussion yesterday with the work on the SDGs. How do they link with the SDGs and the work being done there? You know, that we dovetail that, and why you probably know better of work going on in that field. Secondly, I don't see a need to review all the standards, but what I do suggest is that we look at a matrix, you know, to see where there are possible impacts on human rights in the different standards, just to indicate to reporters where they should consider the different impacts and reporting on those. And then lastly, yesterday was Human Rights Day in South Africa, public holiday, and being a country having gone through tremendous change, we face a lot of human rights challenges, you know, simple things like freedom of speech versus hate speech, you know, that is a real issue for us in the country. Things like land rights, all of those issues, and certainly, you know, when we review that, I will also have a look at that and how we can contribute. Thank you, Judy.
First of all, I really welcome the idea that we're going to deal in some way with human rights. It's, I think, as I said last year, this is one of the things that we have to overcome. We've fallen a little bit behind the curve on this, and we need to deal with it, so I welcome that. And also, I think the paper was excellent because it's a very, very complex subject, and it sets out a lot of the things that we have to consider before moving ahead in a way that I think is very useful. But what I wanted to do right now, keeping in mind what Judy said was the subject, and is to respond to something Chelsea said, because I think that there's a broader consideration we need to consider even before we consider some of the things in this paper. And I'd like to start by looking at some of the GRI history, and in particularly G2. In G2, and you know, we did make a decision to move some of the labor considerations, such as freedom of association and child labor, into the human rights area, which I think was a good decision. But that's not what I'm talking about. It was in G2 that the GRI, I think, made a decision that prevented an early death. And that was a decision to specifically refer to authoritative intergovernmental instruments addressing business behavior specifically, and to the extent that they could, try to tailor the reporting requirements based on those instruments. And so you see in G2 a specific reference to the OECD guidelines, to the ILO tripartite declaration. You see much more language that's related to authoritative intergovernmental comments, and I think that was extremely important for the health and future of GRI. Now, also, I think what happened was you need to remember the context of the time. CSR was sort of in its early to mid-range thing, and a lot of businesses were adopting their own sort of behavior codes, usually in consultation with their PR people or their advertising agencies or self-selected civil society organizations that were expressing concern. But they were basically making it up as they go along. And I think that GRI was one of the things that played a role in its effort to harmonize things, that also put an end to this kind of inventiveness and recognizing that it wasn't the responsibility of business to decide what was good for society. It was the responsibility of business to reflect the broader societal interests as defined by others. And so I think that was a big change. And obviously, one of the points to that is we now need to see and appreciate fully where society is going with some of these things. And in that, when we look at the guiding principles on business and human rights, it's not just about human rights. That's the first thing. And it's also a way of seeing that instrument, which was the most important instrument on business behavior in 35 years, was saying something else. And what it was addressing was the relationship of the government to business in terms of how they would respond to these things. And there was, I think, in the period of the 90s and all the way through most of the 2000s, a sort of conceptual problem. And the problem was sort of like this. Many governments were not respecting human rights in their countries. There was major governance gaps. And what was the relationship of business to those governance gaps? And did this create a responsibility for business to fill in the gaps, or was there a different responsibility? And there was a lot of confusion here. And I think that the guiding principles, and one of the reasons why they are so important, is they brought a conceptual clarity to that. And what they said was that the state has a duty, businesses have responsibility, and the two are independent of each other, meaning that the business responsibility can't be blown off by business because the state isn't doing its duty. And the state can't claim the business responsibility as a way of not doing its duty or this or that. That distinction was the clarity that was brought by the guiding principles, not just to human rights. So when we saw the OECD revise its guidelines, which I think continue to be the most authoritative instrument for business behavior, and the one that is the most widely used and the one that you have to pay attention to. When they revised this, they incorporated this idea from the guiding principles, but they extended it beyond human rights and into other areas, including the environment. Now, The second major idea in the guiding principles that was also subject to the same treatment was the process of due diligence. What the guiding principles did is they took a concept that was familiar to business and something that they didn't object to, and they expanded it. You know, the due diligence in the guiding principles is not the same as the transactional due diligence we see in the world of finance, for instance. It's a different concept, but it's similar enough that it's readily understood by business and adopted. And again, in the OECD, this concept of due diligence, and which concept? The concept in the guiding principles, not the earlier concept. The concept in the guiding principles then becomes expanded to other areas, and that would include, for instance, the environment and consumers and this and that. So it goes, again, beyond human rights. And I think that there was in not only in the OECD, but in future efforts to deal with concepts like business responsibility. So you have in the EU, you had the reporting requirements, and you had in France you now have the due diligence law, this and that. They are talking not just about human rights, but they're talking about certain conceptions that arise out of the guiding principles. So they're talking about a due diligence in this sense of the guiding principles. They're talking about the responsibility in the sense of the difference between what the business does and what the state does in the sense of the guiding principles. Now, there's one third area which also, I think, has been subject to this same treatment of taking it from the guiding principles and expanding it to the world that we are in. And that is the responsibility of an enterprise with respect to its other business relations. So you know, and this, of course, we recall, you know, for now 15, 20 years about the supply chain relationships and how originally, and I was there meeting with Nike over 20 years ago when they explained to me that it wasn't their responsibility. It really wasn't. And of course, look at all the changes that have made since then. But this notion of what is going to be the responsibility of one enterprise with respect to these other enterprises. And again, the guiding principles offered something that was readily accepted by business and readily accepted by the critics of business. And it sort of brought a conceptual clarity. Basically, business did not want to be held responsible for the gaps of government. They didn't feel it was their job to step in and replace government when it was. They didn't feel it was their job because that there were injustice and poverty in the world, that they were responsible to directly end it. I mean, that wasn't their role in society, and I think the guiding principles reflect that and had that conception. So what happened was the relationship of the adverse impact would be linked to the enterprise in one of three ways. They were causing the adverse impact, they were contributing to it, or they were otherwise directly implicated in it and linked in it. And so the guiding principles introduced that concept. And once again, the OECD said, yes, that's right, and we're going to apply it to other concepts as well. And once again, that notion of due diligence, for instance, in the French law, is based on that concept. It's based on the enterprise relationship to a negative impact. So what I am saying in all of this is, as we look at the revising the human rights, I think we also need to take a decision as to whether we also might want to take a look at some of these principles in an overarching way to to some of the other disclosures. And what am I talking about? I think I'm talking about the disclosure and management approach, for instance. And I'm talking not about human rights. I'm talking about business relationships, due diligence processes, that sort of thing. And I'd like to end with a story, which is about what our own experience was. In the G.3, we created a supply chain working group because at that point in the GRI history, there was this idea of making incremental improvements, and the supply chain issues were one of the ones that were the most sought out after at the time, and so this group was created. And then, of course, the decision to do G4 was made before the supply chain group finished its work. But nevertheless, the supply chain group was included in the G4 process at that point. Now, two things happened, good and bad. One is the supply chain work in the standards, I think, is a little excessively detailed relative to some of the other subjects, because there was this specific group. But the other thing is we lost a problem because the supply chain is one end of what we call a value chain. And I don't think that the supply chain is the whole picture, and I don't think the value chain is the whole picture because there are other business relationships that are not necessarily in either side of the supply chain that also relate to reporting and responsibility. But we couldn't deal with that, and we couldn't deal with that because the decision was to have a supply chain working group. It wasn't a decision to have a value chain working group or a business relationships working group. So I'm thinking that what we need to do is, at this early stage, decide which of these general principles we need to look into that are inherent in human rights, but also of value to the whole thing. And we've already agreed that part of this is staying ahead of the curve. Well, we're not ahead of the curve if we do this. We're just on time.
Thanks, Dwight. Julia.
Thank you, and good job, Laura, on your presentation, and thank you for it. I would just agree that I think this is something that we should be looking at, and I particularly agree in the area of policy and due diligence. It's important for any company, regardless of what their material issues might be. I would encourage you to look at the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. They have some relatively new human rights-related disclosures they're asking companies for, and I think that's a good source of due diligence, especially.
Thank you very much. Sulema.
I've tried to write down what I want to say because we don't have much time left, but I fully agree with Dwight, and I want to congratulate the team. This is a very, very good piece of paper, piece of work. The research is very comprehensive. And in spite of that, I'm still not comfortable with the use of some terms and this division between right to right because of the very nature of the human rights. So the human rights are universal and interdependent. So there's no such thing like one right above other right, or a business should cope with one right without taking care of another one. So I can provide to you examples on how to better write about the approach on human rights from GRI.
I think that was exactly a point that came through in Laura's presentation, that the more recent work on this issue suggests that there isn't, you can't sort of draw a distinction between the applicability from one concept to another because of the overarching and universal nature of them. And that is one issue that we're dealing with just sort of structurally in GRI, because we do split things up. And therefore, how do we reflect that properly? So I think you're pointing at something that absolutely is part of the challenge for us.
Yes,
Yeah.
but I mean, the idea is over there. Laura has spoken very well about it, but the writing is not accurate yet. So this is my point. And if you want to, because I fully support what Dwight just said, we should really think about the approach of some more strategic disclosures, because human rights is the new umbrella for everything, actually. The environmental impact should be taken care in terms of human rights impacts as well. So we should be very conscious about terms and writing. The idea is over there. I'm just contributing to be more accurate. Okay. And the second point that I would like to make, it seems less important, but for me, it's very important. So I'm not fighting the research or the idea behind the research or the outcomes. I'm fully supportive with the objectives and areas of improvement. But I would not like to see everything supported by the absence of data and information within the current reporters or reporting, sustainability reporting. Between lines 305 and 307 of the document, item 9, you are presenting a figure with data and statistics on where the reporters are reporting or not the current disclosures. And there's a sentence here that shows that the majority of these disclosures are very infrequently reported. And this could suggest that disclosures are not deemed useful for reporters. In my practical experience, this is not the case. Sometimes the business are just not understanding how they would cope with human rights risks, how they would cope with a minimum of management structure, how they would comply with the brand new legislation about supply chain or other issues. So I would refrain, this group should refrain themselves to support a very good piece of work with this type of information. But otherwise, I'm very supportive with what is being proposed, and I think Dwight is very right with his position. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle.
In addition to what Dwight said, I think the pressure is moving on companies simply because states are not moving fast enough. And it's the same for climate change, it's the same for any issue. If you look at electricity consumption, companies are now asked to commit to source electricity fully renewable because half of the electricity in the world is used by private companies. So for me, it's not a surprise to see the burden moving to companies just because states are not moving fast enough. Speaking about the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, knowing quite well the topic for managing the report to the Dow Jones Sustainability Index for the last 5 years, I believe it's already well considered in your analysis and well aligned with what they're doing. About materiality, I had a comment on that, specifically relating to the company I work for, so Solvay, a chemical company. Human rights never came up as a high materiality issue in the past, mostly because despite having multiple channels to report issues, we have a speak up system which is fully external. We have a very strong employee representative groups. We have one consolidated at European level. We have a world forum, which meets with our manager twice a year, and we have traditional channels of reporting. I don't remember ever a human rights issue coming up to corporate level. And the chemical industry usually was more attacked on environmental impact and on their products portfolio than on human rights. So it never came up as a high materiality issue. But the bottom line of that is, since we don't have a formal due diligence process, we're also unable to demonstrate that it's not material. And it's a bit the change that I see compared to before. Before, you only needed to prove that some issues were high materiality, and by default, what was not high materiality was moderate or low materiality. This is the first time that companies are asked to prove, really, whether it's material or not. And so I think any enterprise will need some form of due diligence process and some form of risk assessment, if only to be able to substantiate the fact that it's material or not for them.
Yeah, and I think this issue of the universality of human rights actually isn't unique to human rights. I mean, there are many responsibilities that are universal to companies, and the question is, in the context of reporting, what exactly do you need to demonstrate as far as the threshold for what goes into a report or what doesn't go into a report, regardless of the fact that companies have always a responsibility not to violate the law or to to look after the environment or so forth, and indeed to support universal human rights. So there's a sort of a basic conceptual issue here that is flagged up in the discussion of human rights, but may not be exclusive to the issue of human rights. Laura, are you getting an answer to these questions? Do you feel? Is this? I'm just keen to make sure that the Standards Division has some clear information and response from the board as to how to proceed with this discussion before we move on to the next part of our conversation today.
Well, yeah, thank you for your comments. I just would like to get a sense of whether the board wants to indeed go ahead with developing some overarching content or principles around due diligence and business relationships across all topics, because that changes the scope of the project significantly, and that influences also the group of experts that we put together to do this work.
Okay, I've got Nankumar and Bastian and Sulema.
Good morning once again. I agree with the first point of Mr. Stian saying that we need not restrict it to the present standard. We need to expand it to and look into the other standards like the environment, like he mentioned about the energy consumption or the water. So we need a matrix approach wherein we need to see which of the human rights could be impacted across the standard. That's second thing, the materiality. I do agree that most of them try to rate the materiality low, especially when it comes to human rights. Basically, because we are not able, most of the reporters, especially ones which are verified, they are not able to understand the impact of human rights. Second area is one of them is the grievance. The grievance spreads across the two. And once again, there's not a clear line that which of the grievances are human rights grievance. And the fourth point came up was the supply chain. And the maximum human rights impact occurs in the supply chain. So I think we need to strengthen the supply chain disclosures with reference to the human rights. And as the report points out, the DMA, I too agree that DMAs are not reported fully with reference to the human rights. So in my opinion, we need to look at the complete human rights standards afresh and do a detail. And as she suggested, that we could bring out the overarching guidance on the human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Bastian.
Just to reflect one moment on the point that Laura was making, if indeed we want to look at these structural elements and things that we can carry through from the guiding principles into our overall approach to the standards, that is work that almost precedes what is outlined in Laura's contribution today. And I would not feel comfortable to necessarily run these two processes in parallel. So starting detailed human rights work and not having finished this the discussion we just had started by Dwight. So if there are indeed structural elements that need to be carried through holistically across the board for the standards, stemming from the guiding principles, then we should look at this with priority and come to relatively quickly to a conclusion, because otherwise I fear we might be losing time also to catch up, because that was the second urgent plea I think that we heard from several members, that there is a disconnect with best practice in the human rights field specifically. And maybe that is related to that structural element too, but I don't feel comfortable right now. I hear what Dwight is saying, and I would probably support many of the notions. What that means in practice for what we are offering with the standards, I'm not so sure. It would almost implicate a focused research into that, which are the principles that we have to lift and apply across the standards. What are the structural changes that are basically flowing from that? And how does that then relate to the package of work that we have with human rights, but many of the other things that we're just starting? So that's really a discussion we should try to settle today in terms of a mandate for the standards division on what to do in the coming weeks.
Okay, thank you. Sulema and then Chelsea.
I completely forgot to add one point. I know that the process requires time and resources, but I would think, I would like to put on the table consulting the reporters, why they are not coping with the human rights issue, why they are not reporting their human rights minimum management structure, why are you not considering human rights a material topic. I would survey within reporters to support even the outcomes of our work, because why not? It's quite clear that the business, they do have commitments with shareholders, investors, but also they have to live within the society with the minimum social impact, right? So why not? Why they are not understanding? And then we can provide a more clear guidance, in my opinion.
Just to respond a bit to the conversation about bringing some of these guiding principles, expectations, and extending them across to environmental impacts or others, we do see in reporting practice that there is a trade-off in making things more broad and more general versus more specific. And there is a real risk in terms of how these standards are used in practice, that by broadening those concepts, although we all may agree that this is the right thing to do, we will actually see less specific reporting on the kinds of human rights related commitments, expectations, and due diligence mechanisms that was the original driver behind the start of this project. So it's just a question for the group to consider a little bit. Is there a way to do these two things in parallel, but separate, but still maintaining that original focus, which was how do we take the issue of human rights specifically and build into our existing structure disclosures which are more reflective and align better with the key concepts in the UN guiding principles? And can we move ahead with that work as it was originally scoped by the board and still be mindful of the fact that that could produce in the longer term carryover implications for things like a holistic review of the management approach or even the next review of the foundation standard coming down the road? So I think there is a concern that if we pull the whole scope of the project back and we say, actually, the UN guiding principles cover all impacts of an organization and all responsibility of business, and we start there, that the outcome might actually be less specific attention paid to how organizations are dealing with human rights, which was the primary focus at the start of the project.
I've got Kirsten, Dwight, and Robin.
I will really support what Sulema said last year and what Chelsea said. We need to know why do the organizations not report on human rights? Why do they not regard it material? And we also have to make sure that we prioritize what should be prioritized also by the organizations in their reporting. If not, we are at risk of getting a lot of bad reporting. And good example there is the Norwegian Accounting Act that has pretty much prescriptive rules on what should be or shall be reported by an organization, which leads to a lot of those statements. The company does not have any negative impact on the environment. And we don't want that. So we must make sure that we do this in the right way, making sure that there is some sort of materiality perspective here, but maybe we should be much stronger in the guidance on how to evaluate human rights material.
Yeah, I had so many things to say. I chose not to say certain things. and one of them was the materiality issue. The problem there is, I think, missing from what we have right now, and something that would certainly come out if we started looking into the human rights standards, is the notion of saliency. You can't conduct due diligence as an abstract concept. You conduct due diligence against the likelihood of a specific negative impact. And so if you don't know what you're looking for, the chances are you're not going to find it. And I think that what you need to do when you begin a due diligence, and say in the human rights area, or let's take a very common popular subject. If you want to source from Bangladesh, you might have to do due diligence against factory safety, for instance. And that's a salient issue, and therefore one that you need to conduct due diligence against. And so I think the notion is, and I would say this even to reporters today, look, if you're dealing with human labor, and whether it's your own employees or through some contracting arrangement or something else, there's certain salient human rights issues you need to deal with and report on. And the idea that somebody says, yeah, we deal with human labor, but it's not a salient issue. Well, this is an interesting interpretation, and maybe even a common one, but it's not particularly a credible one. Now, if you look at the OECD activities, since they revised their guidelines to reflect the guiding principles, they've conducted policy papers and documents and guidance for states and companies on mineral supply chains, on agriculture, on textile and garments, and they're now working on a general due diligence one right now. Now, in all of these cases, it isn't limited to human rights. You know, the mineral supply chains was not just about human rights. The same for agriculture, same for this or that. And so again, what I'm thinking is if we go and get this right when we revise human rights, in order to get it right, you're going to have to address business relationships. You're going to have to address this expanded notion of due diligence, and you're going to have to address this distinction between the state and the enterprise responsibilities. That you can't successfully do a human rights revision without coming out with those things. And those things actually apply to other things. So we're going to have to know how to do it, because if we go and say, well, this is just human rights and it doesn't apply there, well, that would be a little odd. And so the other thing, and I can hear people saying, oh, no, does he want to open up all the standards? I don't think so. I think the two things you want to open up is DMA and process, and to make sure that this expanded concept of due diligence is reflected in the DMA guidance. And I think you also want to deal with the concept of saliency in materiality, maybe.
Okay, thank you. Robin, and then Evan, and then Kirsten, and then I think we need to conclude this and move on to the next part of this discussion. Sorry, was I meant? Yeah, right. Yeah, Chelsea.
I think it's worth spending the time on this discussion from our view, because it's no point moving into the proposed approach until we get this group fairly clear on the scope of work and what we're trying to do. So I think we're okay to compress later sessions a bit if this discussion does warrant more time and we're still being additive and covering new ground.
That's fair enough. I'd still like to encourage the group to move it towards conclusion as well as we can. Yeah. So thank you.
Thanks, Judy. I would like to congratulate the team. It's a lot of hard work in the paper, and also for Dwight's additional comments. They've been really helpful. I'd certainly made notes when we were talking earlier about repeating this discussion in the next agenda item, because climate risk has the same sort of tone in that sense of reconciling some of these tools. But I would certainly support Dwight's notion of having a tightly scoped piece that does look at how some of these things can be reconciled in the DMA piece or the principles piece around salience and materiality, and how due diligence applies in a as tight a scope as we could possibly get that's still useful and meaningful. But I'd also like to support Salema's notion of a bit of truth testing or practical testing with some of the companies that have been using, preparing dedicated human rights reports, as well as using GRI frameworks as well to see where they see some of the applications, what they've done in practice to work through some of these relationships, and also some of the specific indicators. But so I think that there could be some benefits in asking the companies that are doing reporting on human rights and doing it well, but also perhaps comparing that with companies in the same sort of sector or some of their peers who are silent or much more silent on the issue. I think looking at both of those extremes might be helpful as well.
Just a very short comment to support White's suggestion about including human rights in the management approach. I think that is a very good way of doing it, like we have already done with a few other topics throughout the work with the standards. Thank you.
Okay. Dwight, are you back in the queue?
Okay. Yes, well, actually, just to respond briefly.
Very briefly. Microphone up, yeah.
Yes, I wasn't recommending human rights in the DMA. I was recommending the due diligence approach in the human rights standards to the DMA in a generic way. But, you know, I think it's entirely possible for the Secretariat to scope out a way to have our cake and eat it too on this. I think there's a possibility of doing all this at the same time.
Maybe just to reconcile the discussion up till now, I think that there are two principal level consideration for us here in terms of bringing content back into the standards that is probably generally useful beyond human rights. But what my proposal would be is to actually use this human rights process, because the expertise resides with the human rights experts that we would have to bring to the table. Certainly, we would draw on persons that have been involved in the OECD due diligence work, but beyond that also in the RUGI work and the lead up to the establishment of that norm. When you dissect everything that has been said, I think there are two areas specifically, and it actually relates also back to questions that have come up repeatedly over the last year and even earlier. So there is this due diligence concept. We had discussions last year whether or not it is sufficient what we currently have. We have taken decisions regarding moving contents, but there was the acknowledgement that probably more work was needed for this specific element. So why not use, in terms of scoping the human rights work, this opportunity to bring in the right people with specifically the due diligence background, because this is becoming definitely an art and probably a professional field nowadays. So there are people with that expertise, and make that, give them a mandate to scope this out, to Chelsea's point, with making sure that human rights are covered in this specifically from a due diligence perspective, but also issuing recommendations on how the due diligence section can be written so that it applies to more than just human rights. That would be, in my mind, an elegant way of using the human rights process to sort out the due diligence piece in a broader sense. And in actual fact, what we should be conscious about, we should not be falling back to general expectations regarding describe your due diligence full stop, because this is where we have probably become too generic also in the management approach. What we are seeing is that the responsible will be well, we have a due diligence approach, it follows these 5 steps, and it's generic to everything we do. Thank you. And that is not the type of information we probably want to, so there is a level of specificity that needs to be induced, that needs to be part of that project. When it comes to the business relationships, I struggle a bit more on how to represent that back into this specific human rights project. There is the potential, I think, to issue more guidance in relation to the materiality principle. So not opening up the materiality principle as it stands right now, but the discussion that has been started by Raghi to acknowledge the responsibility for negative impacts beyond just what is under direct control of the organization, and acknowledge business relationships in that context. That could probably be helpful as an extension to what we're already offering. Yesterday it was brought up that there is also a whole section that we have basically moved out of GRI's reporting guidance, and that is waiting for review. So that might be actually a project that we want to be looking at anyways. And that way we could actually address the second point to a certain extent. But what I keep coming back to, I think there is at the core of it a due diligence piece, a baseline expectation, also responsive to what Laura has presented in terms of the indivisibility, the universal expectation. We want each and every company, likely what Michelle has also said, to be able to express what they are doing and to demonstrate their responsibility. And that seems to be the core piece that we have to write into the mandate of and objectives of this human rights work. Thank you.
Can I just test with the group whether Bastian's proposal sounds like a productive one that will, is it to this point, Dwight? Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to Bastian in this sense. I'm not so sure I could separate out the due diligence on one hand from the business relationship, cause, contribute, link to issue. If you do human rights properly, then that issue is unavoidable. It's, you can't avoid it. And it is also related in the same way to due diligence. You're doing due diligence with respect to your business relationships. And so I think that, well, I would agree with the first part of what you said, Bastian. I can't agree with the separation. That has to go with the first part.
Maybe just to clarify, that's not to say that in due diligence we're not covering business relationships, but there seems to be a standalone element of tying back that notion of salience, business relation, consideration for negative impacts beyond the control sphere of an organization. That is something that is missing from the current materiality guidance. This is why lots of the material, from our perspective, material impacts in the human rights space are not reported, because that notion is not quite clear.
Salience is a concept in due diligence. You can't do the due diligence without the salience.
You might all be agreeing across a number of complex issues. Chelsea.
Can I try and capture how we might operationalize your ideas here, Dwight? Because I think what we need to come away with is how do we move this forward? There's a lot of nodding heads around expanding these concepts, but we need some scope to go away and work on. So there's, as I see it, there's 2 approaches, right? One is we follow the approach that Lara sort of outlined at a high level, which is to say, look, the primary objective that we've heard in talking to all of these experts is that we need to be better aligned under the human rights umbrella with the UN guiding principles. That is what came up. I mean, we spoke to the world's leading experts in this area, and that is the #1 recommendation that came up. So we may be able to put together a sort of a straw model together with a couple of informal consultations with experts to bring back to this group in terms of what could that look like, just for the basis of discussion. And from the point of that, then we could make a more informed decision about does that actually require, before we move forward with human rights related content, a broadening and a reopening of the principles or the disclosures in the management approach, or is there enough clarity of work to be able to move forward with the human rights piece, bearing in mind that it will have implications for additional reviews going forward. That is one approach, and I think that's more consistent with what we brought in today as a proposal. The other approach, if I am hearing Dwight correctly, is to say we can't start that piece of work yet. What we actually need is a review of the management approach, GRI 103, in a holistic way that brings these concepts more in line across all material topics or all salient risks and impacts together with the UN guiding principles, and that until we do that piece of work on the management approach, it doesn't make sense to open any human rights specific content. Is that fairly in line, Dwight, with what you're saying, or would you have a different sort of pragmatic approach that you'd like to bring in with the points you made today?
I think that doesn't capture all the alternatives. I think that what I'm saying that is, if we're looking in revising human rights and looking at the various standards we have and some of the other standards that might be affected by this that aren't, specifically human rights, we might also include such things as the generic DMA guidance to reflect some of these things. So I think you can sort of do this sort of neither one before or after. You can more or less do it at the same time if in the mandate for creating the group you specify in a certain way that we also want you to look at DMA because we understand we understand today or yesterday for other people that the due diligence things in the guiding principles are also appropriate for other things. So at the same time you launch this project, you can specify and include in the scope certain things like this. Now we can, and I can sense Bastian's nervousness from over here.
No, it's not nervousness.
No,
It's
no,
actually,
you don't know what I'm
included.
saying.
It is already
you're interrupting me.
included
Yes.
in the scope.
But you didn't. Yeah. You commented on something I said before I said it. So anyway, what I'm saying is Bastian's nervousness about the materiality definition and some of these other things that are also in our standards. And I think we can sort of make a decision to cut off some of this stuff at certain places. So we put some of the DMA in as it relates to due diligence and business relationships, but if we don't want to move that totally into redefining materiality, we can decide not to do that now. But I think that we're discussing scoping a project in a committee, and I think that it's easy to include some of this stuff in that scope.
Michel.
I would recommend to start as Chelsea suggests, meaning starting on human rights, but bearing in mind that concepts like due diligence, risk assessments, will most probably be expanded to other topics. And so keeping that open, but using the topic of human rights a bit like a pilot for the rest. At least that's what I will recommend internally for us when we implement that within our own company.
Thank you. Yeah. So do you want to get in on this?
Yeah, no, just to say, I think in the initial proposal that was outlined in the paper, it was actually said that we would commission a technical committee, we'll come to that, but to issue recommendations on, to the GSB on other GI standards that might require updating. And explicitly mentioned was foundation and the management approach. I think just reflecting on where we are landing with this discussion, probably we have to make that link to the management approach explicit and highlight that there seems to be in particular the due diligence component that needs to be looked at, and give a specific mandate, have the right people in the room to issue recommendations around that. And then if it is indeed falling in place and can be done at the same time, also acknowledge that what we are actually looking for in terms of recommendations should have broader application than just human rights. I think that's the other thing that probably is not particularly well covered in the current proposal.
So, I mean, as far as impacts beyond the human rights related topic-specific standards, we actually don't know yet what we're dealing with, but we can imagine that some of these things will come into play. And I mean, it could even be reporting principles. Nobody's brought that up yet, but we could be looking at some pretty fundamental shifts or tweaks or adjustments or additions or what have you, and we can't preempt that and we can't predict it at this stage. But maybe when we get into the practical discussion of how to approach this, we want to keep in mind the need at a future stage for a sort of a reconciliation process, you know, that you have, we'll have learned some stuff by doing the human rights work, and we will then need to figure out how to apply that in different places at a broader level or a more specific level elsewhere in the standards. So maybe that's something that we can get onto when we go into the practical process. Dwight.
Yeah, I'm hearing something different than what I suggested, which was you mandate the group to, for instance, take the human rights due diligence concepts and recommend how they can change the DMA. And that's not the same thing as saying, well, if we do the human rights thing, we might then see if that applies. I mean, one is that first and then that, and the other is the group is mandated to do both at the same time. I think at the end of the process, if I understand the process, if it doesn't work or if it doesn't succeed or they come up with a bad recommendation or we're not prepared to go that way, well, that's a decision we can make at that time. But the idea is if you create a scope and you include this in the scope, then I think it's going to be a lot easier than it is to sort of try to say, well, we'll then look at this. You know, my suggestion was to do it all at once.
Well, yes, I think that is also the suggestion of the standards division, but also, if I might say, that it's quite important because we'll need to make sure that the right people are in the room, and if we are requiring them to be simultaneously human rights experts and much broader conceptual reporting experts, we might be tying our hands behind our backs a bit unnecessarily here. But I do think that this very, because it is written into the mandate or into the proposed mandate in the discussion document here, that those be explicitly part of the review of this committee. But exactly what latitude we want to give them to pursue this on behalf of all of the standards, that's still our responsibility as the standards board to work that out in the end. Is that you putting, yes, Chelsea?
Yeah, so what I'm hearing, and Lara, feel free to chime in, is that we have enough clarity at the moment to go ahead and rewrite a project proposal, which includes those two sort of balancing scopes. So a focus on human rights, but with the explicit expectation that key concepts like due diligence and alignment with other elements, business relationships of the guiding principles, would need to be expanded or would foreseeably be expanded to cover other issues, including environmental impacts. And then we can also put some thought together in terms of what kind of membership of a technical committee or what points of views or expertise we would recommend would need to be considered in order to try and do those two things. But from a structural perspective, I think the way that we've looked at approaching this is that the recommendations of that group would be structure agnostic. They're not looking at 3 specific GRI standards to review them. They're looking at coming back with draft content recommendations and gaps and ideas about how to approach that. And then it is really up for this board, I think, to largely think about how that fits into our existing structure and what that might mean, whether it means new standards, whether it means revisions to existing content, or whether it's a phased approach where we say, okay, there are some elements that can be slotted in now, and there are some elements that will be brought in with future, more holistic reviews of the foundation standard or other standards. So I think they will not have the deep understanding, and nor will we be able to give them the deep understanding of the structure that we have now. I think that does come back to this group at some point to take decisions on.
Dwight and then Salema.
I'll be real brief. I'm trying to avoid the supply chain mistake. The supply chain looked at only upstream, so therefore when we were in the group, we could not look at downstream. And I think that it needs to be crafted in a way that takes into this.
I should apologize, but maybe I might missing something, because if you're trying to be more aligned and harmonized with the guiding principles, and if the guiding principles are telling to the business that they should take care of their relationships in order to avoid risks to human rights and to grant the basic human rights, and we are scoping a technical group to support us to make the changes that are required in order to be more aligned with the guiding principles, we shouldn't ask for environmental specialists, impact specialists. So there are a lot of currently human rights specialists coping with the alignment of business with the guiding principles. So I might be missing something, but I'm not understanding. I understand the complexity of scoping the work and to point out the right people to support our decision-making process. But I'm missing the point of, well, should we include reporter expertise within this group? Well, a lot of human rights specialists are contributing to other frameworks to report on human rights. So it's not that difficult in my point of view, but I might be missing something. It's not about to revise the foundation. The DMA needs some additional requirements for sure. Otherwise, we are not aligning the GRI standards with the UN guiding principles, because the DMA is not coping with the due diligence process as it stands. But I mean, I'm not see the complexity of not being able to put the right people on the table to provide us with elements to make a decision in terms of the revision of the standards.
Okay, can we move on? Have we got what we need on this area? Laura?
Maybe, Judy, it's worth you summarizing just what you have taken away. I'm not sure if I'm quite clear on Salema's last point in terms of how that plays off of what we were proposing in Dwight's comment. So
Okay.
I'm not sure that we're quite clear at the moment, or I'm clear. Are you clear? No.
What I'm taking away from this conversation, and it's important that we get this right and clear, that it is understood by the board that there are likely to be implications from the review of human rights related standards that will go beyond the current scope of the human rights related standards, that will address deficiencies or requirements in the DMA, foundation standard, possibly elsewhere. We don't know where that is yet. At a later stage, we may decide that this has implications across many different topics besides human rights, but through the vehicles of the foundation standard or the DMA or wherever it happens to be in the elsewhere in the standards. And we need to be prepared to incorporate those, to understand those implications, and to incorporate those where we feel it is necessary to do so. Therefore, the fact that that the DMA or the foundation standards will be part of the review, part of the discussion of a technical committee or working group or other process is very much acknowledged, but the kind of wider implications of that remain the responsibility of this group to consider at a later stage. Am I right about that? Kind of right? Or no? Right, Dwight?
First of all, I think that we're looking at a group that then produces a product that then goes to this body. And therefore, I don't think there's any need to say at a later stage, in this sense, you can tell this group to do these things. And if they come to us with something that we think is not working out, that, well, we agree to all of this, but this foundation recommendation change we can't really go with right now. I think that then becomes at a later time. But I don't think you need to say at the very beginning, these things will be now and those things might be later. I'm saying that you just give a scope to these things, which includes these things for how this expanded concept of due diligence might be put in the DMA, how saliency might be dealt with in due diligence and blah, blah, blah. And they come up with this. And I think that we can then say, if we're very uncomfortable with what they come up with as it affects the other standards, well, we say, well, this was the scope, but it wasn't quite how we feel. We don't feel that we can modify these standards that way at this time. So then we can kick the can further down the street. But I'm saying not to say, oh, and by the way, we're going to kick the can down the street before we even ask you to do anything. It's going to be a two-stage. I think let's see if we can do this. Let's see if the due diligence that is inevitable out of the human rights thing can then be put into the DMA at the same time.
So let me probe this just slightly a bit more with you, Dwight. So we understand, for example, that there could very well be implications for this broader concept of due diligence that have to do with climate change, for example. Would it be your opening position that we ought to assume that a human rights related standards review will be able to propose content that will be that will be topic universal? Should we make that assumption? Would that be wise to make that assumption right now, or would it be wise for us to say we understand that there will be broader concepts at play here that we will need to be able to deal with at a later stage, but that we have to make sure that we are comfortable with the wider implications of it at a later stage. And maybe we're actually saying the same thing, but we're sort of saying it from different angles here.
I think that if the human rights process considers due diligence, it will be the same kind of due diligence that is already agreed by governments to apply in other areas. And that it might be the thing to do is to, if you succinctly deal with that concept of due diligence, you can apply it to the generic guidance that already exists on DMA as part of the same process. So I think it's not, we do have guidance on due diligence, on DMA, and I'm asking that guidance take this kind of stuff into account at the time we do this, and I think it would be safe to say that would be right. I don't think you have to it doesn't, we don't have to get so, we're talking about generic guidance. We're not talking about beyond into specific issues. We're talking about a certain kind of due diligence that already has been applied to these other areas. I'm not talking about something else. And it's something that would occur as if the human rights group did its job, then it would come up with this because this already exists.
I like your optimism on this. To my mind, we are talking quite abstractly here, and I don't really know what specifically we might expect from this group. But I'm willing to have faith in the process. Chelsea, do you want to respond?
Okay, I think we feel clearer now. So what Lara and I have been trying to wrap our head around is it sounds like the first sort of group consensus is that yes, alignment with the UN guiding principles is the overarching #1 priority for the review of the human rights standards, and that may have implications that go beyond human rights as related to some of these key concepts like due diligence and saliency. We are, I think, as a group, reasonably confident that it makes sense to move ahead looking at a human rights set of draft recommendations from a technical committee, so not a full project working group at this point, but with the explicit scope of the mandate of that technical committee to also consider how some of these key concepts could potentially be expanded and to, if possible, provide draft recommendations on how those could be expanded to cover other impacts like environmental impacts that go beyond human rights. And if the group generally is comfortable with that, then we feel comfortable that we can go away and refine the project proposal and come back with a more explicit mandate for that technical committee that the GSSB can review either at your next meeting or the meeting after that. And the other takeaway that we have captured, I think, which is very useful for us, is to do some further consultation with reporters to really understand their current reporting practice and reasons that they are or are not reporting specific elements of human rights. And we can bring that back as well as part of that proposal for the GSSB to review. Does that feel roughly accurate with the group? Judy, does it resonate?
Salema.
Thank you, Chelsea. I really you just said what translated my expectation in terms of the first step towards the revision of the subject. I know that it's very complex and sometimes it's not tangible for everybody what would be the outcomes of this revision, but I really agree with your proposal. Sorry.
Yeah, I have no problem with what you said, but you listed two things. I would add list three: due diligence, saliency, and business relationships.
Just one addition, based on the discussions we had on due diligence, I think we should also formally acknowledge in the project proposal that there is a body of work emerging out of the OECD related to due diligence. And it's not only the UN guiding principles, but that there has been follow-up work. And probably it's actually the same people that we're looking for. Many of the human rights people have moved on to the OECD to help with the due diligence work. But I would formally note that as a normative reference for the work, also when we try to compose that working group.
Okay, good. We are half an hour behind schedule. We still have part of this conversation yet to get through. Yeah. Yeah. But I just want to recognize that we are going to be losing people early today and throughout the course of the afternoon. So I'd like to not, lose too many people before we've gotten through the really important things today. Can you move us on from? Are we?
We've covered in that last the proposed approach going forward. So I think we covered everything that we need to cover for that session.
Are you happy with that? Okay.
Okay.
All right, that's fine. That's fine then. In which case, let's have a break and come back here at the top of the hour at 11 o'clock, please. Thank you.